So a racist, a chauvinist, and a narcissist walk into a bar. And the bartender says, "What can I get for you, Mr. President-elect?" Sorry. That's my US joke for the day. So Trump's getting inaugurated in 2 days. Don't ask me as a futurist to explain how that happened. I've got no explanation for it, right? I don't know how it sort of works. But anyway, so I want to talk about the shift that's occurring in banking, and I thought I'd start with a picture of Mars, because Trump could very much be a catalyst for moving to Mars for much of humanity if it goes all wrong. But Elon Musk has said that the only way for mankind to make the step to be an interplanetary species is to completely rethink the process of rocket design. And he talks about the principle or first principles design, which is going back to sort of the core physics of an idea and fixing that. And so I want to talk about why first principles as a design approach is ultimately killing the bank, why it's killing banking, and what the momentum is building behind this. So we start with the fact that if you look historically at technology's role in banking, we sort of go through three major phases in terms of technological development. The first is the mainframe era, and this started with IRMA, which was the first bank mainframe, electronic recording machine for accounting. And this was in 1952, 53. MIT was involved in this, but it was the first bank mainframe. And what's really interesting about that is the decision to use a mainframe for check processing introduced bank account numbers. Because prior to mainframes, you just had your name written on a card, index card, in a bank branch. That's how they did bank accounts. So the mainframes weren't capable of sorting customer data alphabetically at those days, so they had to put a number in. That's where you get account numbers from. So technology's always had this influence on bank design. So we go from the mainframe era and we go to the self-service era. And this was with the introduction of the first piece of fintech innovation, according to the ex-Fed chairman, which is Paul Volcker. This was the start of broad automation of process in banking. But we're now shifting, and the internet was sort of started this, we're now shifting into the experience era. And this is where banking starts to become embedded in our life. And this is a fundamental shift in terms of the way we've thought about bank utility. I'm going to get to that in a moment. This really is the biggest shift since the Hammurabi Code, and in terms of the Medici formation of banking, because it will fundamentally change the way we think about access to banking services. It's a massive shift. This is why we have to go back to first principles to redesign this. So we've seen some discussion today about digital transformation of banks, and part of that is taking bank products and being able to distribute those through mobile and other things. Well, the experience era for banking is actually going to destroy bank products, and I'll explain why that is. But this is just the start of some major disruptive changes in terms of the sector. So it starts with four major disruptive themes, and this is from the book Augmented. So we start with artificial intelligence. This is obviously going to be the highest impact disruptive theme that we'll see over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And how this is going to affect us is that by introducing AI into our daily lives, we are delegating much of what humans and processes have built through the structures that we have today. So we're going to have to change that to delegate agency to AI. The second piece is, as we start to embed technology in the world around us, it changes the way we have to design interactions. So whether that is embedded screen technologies, whether that is voice user interfaces, whether that is sensors that you wear on your body to track your health, we have to start redesigning interfaces. We have to start redesigning interactions. Service businesses won't be relevant unless they can deliver services through this technology layer. So it's like we have to put this entire new skin on the world. Any interactions that we would typically have with service organizations, whether it's an accountant or a legal firm or a doctor or a banker, we're putting a new entry point into that, which is technology first. Technology will be embedded in everything we do, every experience we have. Now, this is going to drive particular changes in the way we think about health tech and medical treatment. So gene editing is one small example. I don't want to dive into this because this is a fintech conference, but just to give you one example, diseases like hemochromatosis, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cystic fibrosis, breast cancer are all genetic disorders. So in the future, technology, and we're not very far away from this because we're experimenting with this gene therapy technology now, we'll just be able to edit those bugs out of our DNA. And that's how we'll come to think of diseases like that. So rather than look at medicines to treat these diseases, we'll just edit the disease out of our DNA. Now there's ethical considerations around that, but this is such a dramatic change to society. Now when you sort of bring all these together, you end up with economies that are differentiated by the way they use technologies. So they become smart economies. Now this is really smart cities, smart economies, smart companies, are all those that leverage these technologies to differentiate. Now ultimately, whichever industry you look at, whether it's the financial services industry, or whether it's medical, or whether it's manufacturing, the leading organizations over the next 10, 20 years will all be technology companies because they're much more efficient at deploying capital and they know how to integrate these experiences technically into our life. So these are the big disruptive themes. But it's driving a change in terms of the way we think about design, the way we think about interactions. So this is where we come back to first principles. Now I use the picture, of course, of the SpaceX Falcon 9. They just had a launch last week and it landed. I'm going to show you that in a moment. But first principles is really key to understand the scale of disruption. There you go. Drinking game? No. Okay. The scale of disruption that we're going to see in financial services. Because many people categorize that fintech is just putting a new skin on old rails. But that's not the case. Now we're starting to understand the impact of this change. First principles shows that actually it's a complete redesign of the financial services system. Now to illustrate this, we'll go back to rocket science. Okay? Now this is the V2 rocket. And if you know your history around the V2 rocket, at the end of the Second World War, the US was very targeted on getting into Germany and capturing about 1,500 leading scientists who were German rocket scientists. They even had a list for that. They called it Operation Paperclip, and the list was called the Blacklist for 1,500 people. And at the very top of this list was one individual. It's this guy, Wernher von Braun. Now, I don't know if you've heard of him before, I'm sure you have. He went on to be one of the big directors of NASA and was essentially responsible for this, the program, the Apollo space program. Now, the time the Apollo space program was built, 4% of US's GDP went into development of the Apollo program. This is a massive amount of money. In today's term, an average launch of Apollo would cost $1.2 billion. This was a major national effort to beat the Russians to the moon, right? But this was essentially, the Saturn V was essentially an iteration on the V2 rocket. Wernher von Braun said the only reason he got into the German rocket program with the V2s was to try and get men closer to the moon. Now, in the 50, 60 years since the Saturn V, we've only just got the cost to orbit of a pound or a kilogram to orbit down by about 60 to 70%. What's really interesting about first principles is when you look at Elon Musk's SpaceX team and their approach to design, they've managed to reduce that cost to orbit by 95% from the space shuttle in just 8 years by applying first principles design to this. Now, this is the landing of the Falcon 9 on Just Read the Instructions, which is the floating, what do they call that, platform that they had just last week. I mean, this is really impressive stuff. Have you seen those people on YouTube trying to flip the bottle so it lands end up? You know, just imagine trying to do that, but from orbit. You know, this is really, really tricky stuff. But not only have they been able to build this technically, but by going back to first principles in terms of design, they've been able to radically reduce the cost to orbit. Now, why am I telling you this? first principles is not just about completely rethinking design based on the technology we have today, but it's also about the fact that there's massive cost efficiencies when you go back to the drawing board. Let me put it very, very simply. If we didn't have a banking system today that involved branches and regulation and signing a piece of paper to get a mortgage, if you were redesigning the banking system today, would you put any of those things in the banking system if you're redesigning it from scratch today? The answer is absolutely no. That's what first principle is all about. And when we look for examples of first principle in the world around us, we see some great paradigms in terms of design elements. So in 2007, we see an example of first principle redesign of the phone. This was take not just a phone for making phone calls, and let's not try taking a Palm Pilot and redesigning that. Let's take an iPod, a browser, and a phone and rethink the utility of that on a day-to-day basis. So Apple used here, or Steve Jobs, was a great proponent of first principles when it came to designing the iPhone. Have you heard the story about how he designed the iPod, which was the precursor, obviously, to the iPhone? He used to carry around a block of wood in his pocket, and he would sketch up little UIs on Post-it notes and stick it on the block of wood, and he would resize the block of wood to see what was the perfect device, size of the device he could carry around in his pocket that would make sense as an MP3 player, or in case of the music player. But Apple hasn't got everything right. You know, they haven't done all of their product design in terms of first principles. In fact, when we look at Apple Pay, this is a great example of the alternative to first principles, which is design by analogy. Okay, now what they just did is they took a card and they stuck it in the phone. They even have a picture of a card. So this is not first principles redesign of payments. If we want to look at first principles redesign of payments, we're going to be talking about Paytm, M-Pesa, Alipay, WeChat. We're not talking about Apple Pay because this was an iteration. Now you have to say, well, why did Apple not redesign this? Part of it, and this sort of comes back to the last panel, part of it may be that they were forced by the players in this ecosystem, the legacy behavior, the POS infrastructure, the regulation around that, to iterate on this rather than start from a clean slate. But in China, where there wasn't legacy behavior, there wasn't legacy networks, there wasn't the requirement to have it on the old rails, which is why you could say Alipay is much more of a first principles approach to payments than Apple Pay was. Now, this is the key problem for banking. This process of iteration is sort of been now sort of hard-coded into the way we think about banking. In fact, every product starts with this basic premise, or a mindset, a culture within the bank is, this is a product that we would get through the branch. And then we sort of retrofit it and try and fit it onto a mobile channel or a web channel. This has been a key design problem for us. So this iteration rut that we have in banking, the thinking that we have to distribute a product on a new channel, is one of our biggest problems. It's one of our biggest issues in terms of adapting to this. We should say, okay, forget the whole product thing, forget the channel thing. Just how do we simply enable a customer to have access to what they need from the bank in real time on a device, rather than saying, let's take a product, a plastic card that we sold through a branch so you get access to credit using a point of sale, and let's figure out how to get that on a phone. That's definitely design by analogy. Now the problem with iteration is it's starting to fail. The banking system no longer has the margins, because as technology has increased competitiveness and put a focus on operational efficiency, the margins are being squeezed down to nothing, and acquisition has got much, much tougher. Now this is where the neobanks have really been able to differentiate. And if you look at acquisition cost for a bank like ourselves, or a neobank like ourselves, Move-In, or Simple, then our acquisition cost of customers, depending on the channel we're using, ranges between about $5 US for an acquisition through to about $40 US for acquisition. Now, you compare that to Chase or B of A, and I don't know what DBS's figures on this are, but for Chase and B of A, it's $350 US per customer. Now, those cost of acquisitions have doubled and tripled over the last 30 years as a result of the fact that customer behavior has shifted, and it's no longer as efficient as it was in terms of acquiring customers. Marketing campaigns aren't working as efficiently. Conversion numbers are dropping off. It's just much tougher. That's why it's more costly. So iterating on that same design problem is not going to solve the problem of cost. It's not going to change the margins. Those margins just continue to get worse. And ultimately, when you think about this problem, and you have someone like Jack Ma look at this from a first principles perspective, he has a very simple approach. Let's hear what he had to say about this when he was comparing Alibaba with Walmart in the United States.
You know, you did a great job, and blah, blah, blah. So I said, maybe in 10 years we'll be bigger than Walmart. You say, young man, you have a good hope. So we said, make a bet. I think in 10 years we'll be bigger than Walmart on the sales. Because if you want to have 10,000 new customers, you have to build a new warehouse and this, that. For me, 2 servers.
So this is a reason why Walmart will never be able to compete with Alibaba in terms of acquiring customers. It's also the very same reason why traditional banks with branch networks will never be able to compete with a neobank in terms of acquisition capability, or an Alipay, for example. There's no iteration you can possibly do to be that efficient in terms of acquiring customers. The legacy infrastructure you have just makes you uncompetitive. Now, if you don't believe me on this, let's look at Yuebao. Now this is, we could argue on the toss of this is probably the most successful savings product in the world. $93 billion in assets under management. When they launched this product in 8 months, they raised over $80 billion in deposits. Clearly the most successful deposit-taking product in China. And when you look at the cost of acquisition, it's pennies on the dollar to acquire customers. But this is driven off this transactional platform of Alipay as well, and it's helped Alipay even further. Now, if you want to understand the scale of Ant Financial today, at the peak, when they have their singles day, they're doing transaction volume at around 97,000 transactions per second. Now, this sounds a lot, right? It sounds even more when you realize that at the absolute peak, Visa does just 7,000 transactions per second. So this is today, this is the scale that Ant Financial has over the Visa network globally today. But they've disrupted savings. But they did that with a first principles design approach. They didn't try and put a traditional savings product on a mobile phone. They just thought about how to shift people that had funds in Alibaba and other parts of the Alibaba platform and Alipay into a savings product or into a savings bucket. So the problem is not about redesigning branches. The reason customers aren't coming to branches today is not because there's not enough technology in branches. It's not because branches aren't sexy enough. It's not because branches don't look like Apple stores. It's because I just don't need to come to a branch to do my banking today. Now, if you try to reinforce the branch model and try and enforce the fact that you need customers to get into the branch, you don't understand the problem. The problem is not a design problem. You can't redesign the branch to fix this because it's a behavioral shift. Shifting away from the branch to the phone. Shifting away from products to experiences. So every bank that still relies on revenue through the branch is doomed to failure because the economics will fail at some point in the near term. Now, this iterative design means that even when banks talk about websites and mobile, they talk about it in terms of this iteration from the branch. This is a quote from Ross McEwen at RBS in 2014. He said, "Our busiest branch is the 701 from Reddington to Paddington." This is the iterative thinking that we have in incumbents, and this is why we have this limited progress in terms of iteration. Now, I have to say, I first thought about websites like that in Bank 2.0. I put this very analogy. I've since sort of thought this. But this is a great example of first principles design of a bank account. Uber launched the ability for their drivers to get bank accounts. Now, why they did this is 30% of their drivers in the United States had never had a bank account. They were driving for yellow taxis, yellow cabs, and they'd been in the cash economy. But they can't get paid cash by Uber, so they needed a debit card. Uber found that they couldn't recruit drivers fast enough if they relied on other banks issuing them cards, so they did partnership with GoBank and other banks to issue an Uber-branded debit card themselves. In doing so, Uber became one of the largest acquirers of SME bank accounts in the United States. But they don't want to be a bank. They're not trying to get into banking. They're just building the ability to get access to the banking platform into the driver onboarding process. And this is a key element of the experience design, the experience redesign of banking. Because as we start to embed banking in our daily lives, the utility of banking, we're going to move away from the traditional distribution mechanics to just having banking embedded in your life. Uber's a great example of that. Now, this has created some real risk for banks. They probably aren't aware of the real risk that's happening right now, but if you look at China, 22% of deposits now are on mobile. This is a phenomenal number. If you're working for any of the big banks in Asia, I doubt that any bank sort of compete with this in terms of deposits. But the effect of that is that this is now increased risk of deposits in China. Now, we'll talk about that in a moment. And in China, 82% of online commerce is mobile too now. These are phenomenal statistics, but this is the shift to the experience economy. Now, it's notable that of the 24 neobanks that are around the world today, the likes of Movin, Simple, Tandem, and others, number 26, not one of these neobanks has made a decision to launch a branch network. Now, that's not just because we believe in digital over branch, it's because the cost, the economics of branches no longer works. Now, banks that still have branches and have that legacy behavior feel like they've got to keep that, but no neobank is starting with a view to launching branches. Now, you might say, well, what about Metro? Well, Metro's not really a neobank. It's why Anthony left and formed Atom, right? Because he had a difference of opinion with, Vernon Hill, who was just trying to reinvent Commerce Bank in London. So the neobanks, they don't want to touch branches because it's just not an efficient acquisition form. And yet we have 1.4 trillion in deposits now held by neobanks, robo-advisors, and mobile money managers around the world. 1.2 billion customers on these new mobile-based platforms today. If you've thought neobanking is just a fad, or it's just something that's that's not serious threat to the major banks or incumbents, these numbers tell a very, very different story when you look at them collectively. No, I don't think anyone's ever done this before, sort of look collectively at the deposit base. Now, in terms of putting these numbers together for Bank 4.0, I had to do a lot of groundwork in terms of ringing my friends at these neobanks and asking them what their deposit base was, and some of them didn't want to say, but managed to sort of put this together over a period of a few months. And it's obviously probably gone up since then. But this is what First Principles is doing to this space. Now, Ant Financial itself is the largest fintech in the world. It's worth $60 billion as of their last funding round in March last year, which puts them just $4 billion under Uber. So this is one of the largest, it is the second largest startup in the world, but they're 3 times the size of Deutsche Bank. Actually, there was a period last year where they were 4 times the size of Deutsche Bank because Deutsche Bank was in real trouble. But this is significant because if you look at their transaction volume just with Visa, the comparison I had before, 96,000 transactions per second compared with 7,000 or 8,000 transactions per second on Visa. Visa is valued at 150 billion today. So the chances are that Ant Financial is well undervalued just on the payments network. That doesn't take into account their deposit business. It doesn't account the other credit business they're doing. Clearly, Ant Financial is massively undervalued, which means that probably in the very near term, Ant Financial will not only be the biggest fintech in the world, but maybe the biggest financial services organization in the world. This is resulting in a rapid erosion of banking models in China. Today, deposits in China are at 40% more risk just because of mobile acquisition potential for deposits. This is not happening in other parts of the world as quickly as we've seen it happen in China. This is why I always state that China is now about 10 years ahead of the United States in terms of their adoption of fintech. You know, when you've still got 2/3 of the world's checks written in the United States, that's a fair indication of their pace of change compared with the likes of China. But this is pretty interesting stuff. This is a radical shift in terms of the way we think about the value system. So then the question is, do we really need banks and banking in the future? This is a very real question. Based on these numbers, clearly something is changing, something is happening. Do we need banks? Well, Bill Gates' quote, which I think he borrowed from someone else, but you know, banks are not necessary. Banking is necessary. Banks are not. We're starting to see the technical implementation of this quote. So when we look at WeChat, WeChat is an example of not just implementing payments in a phone, but it's the stepping away from the debit card and typical checking or current account structure, moving to simple mobile value store. Now, this does exactly the same as a traditional bank account, but it doesn't require a debit card number. It doesn't require the traditional banking structure for distribution of that card. It's a first principles approach to the value store. It's a moving away from the product of a debit card to the experience of money movement. Product to experience. And we start to see that really what this design of mobile optimized utility is doing is shifting us quickly towards this experience world. So what we're doing is we're starting to say, what does the constitute utility of a bank? And you really find there's only 3 pieces to that. There's only really 3 core products that a bank has. And that is the ability to pay, the ability to store value, and the ability to get access to credit. Now, the way you surface that utility, the way you bundle that utility, the way you package it is what we would traditionally call products in the old days. But what mobile and artificial intelligence and voice and mixed reality, augmented reality glasses will do is strip away the product and get us back to the constitute utility. The products are gone, but you still want to save. You still want to send money. You still want access to credit, but you won't need a credit card in this new world, but you will need credit. So how will you get credit in the future? You'll walk into a store and your augmented reality glasses or your phone will say, it looks like you need a bit more money to complete your grocery shopping today. You won't need to pre-approve a credit card. You won't need to go to a branch. You won't need to sign a piece of paper. You'll get access to the utility of the bank through an optimized experience. Ultimately, when we remove all of the friction of the banking system that we have today, we get down to these constitute experiences that have the utility of banking surface, but none of the products and none of the channels, none of the processes, none of the structures. This is why I always say that there is no place for a piece of paper and signature in the future of banking. And I say to banks consistently on this, if you still require a signature on a piece of paper to deliver a product, you are in deep trouble. Yeah. You didn't think I was going to say trouble, did you, Matt? Okay. So there's one other element of this that's really interesting. We've often thought that humans will differentiate from this machine world because of our ability to advise people. This is what makes us different. This is why you want to come into a branch, because you want human contact, because humans will give you great advice. It turns out that actually humans are pretty sucky at advice. If you don't believe this, just look at the US elections. I don't know. We're imperfect. We make mistakes. We repeat those mistakes. This is the problem with humans. Now, machines, as they learn, okay, will they learn the same mistakes? It's quite probable. But there is a very short-term process here where we get to a point where AIs and machines will start to outperform humans. And I want to illustrate some of that for you today. Now, you think about what's the sort of advice you're going to get from your bank in the future or from a startup in the banking and financial services space. The reality is the sort of advice we're going to ask for is not product advice. It's going to be experience. It's going to be experiential advice. So we're not going to say, what's the right mortgage for me to buy this home? Instead, we're going to be asking our AI things like, can I afford to go out for dinner tonight? Or how should I change my spending habits? This is the sort of advice that is experiential, not product-based. And this is where banks actually, when they start thinking about competing with AIs or competing with neobanks, they're often thinking about product advice as the differentiator. You know, think about that as a concept. A bank thinks that the choice of product that you have when you walk into a branch is great advice. I don't think it is. I think it's just a sales pitch. I don't think it actually is advice at all. So when we start redesigning for experiences, we get back to the constitute utility of advice as well in this design process. Now, how's this going to change the way we think about design, you know, as we integrate advice? Well, think about voice as a driver for this change in terms of product to experience. And this is an example of Alec Baldwin, who doubles as Donald Trump, and him using Alexa. And if you haven't seen this, I'll just show you this ad quickly.
Yeah.
You're okay. He's okay. He made it.
Jason, what do you mean?
We were very bad boys.
Alexa, what's in the news?
Here's the news.
Alec Baldwin and Jason Schwartzman were seen mooning paparazzi. Baldwin grew a shoe at photographers before making a run for it.
My poor cashmere socks. Alexa, reorder another pair of Brescianis.
Reordering Bresciani socks.
Okay, listen. Can you send some lawyers or something? Alec.
Now, did you guys notice what he ordered on Alexa? What did he order? Socks, right. $200 cashmere Bresciani socks, if you're interested, if you're taking note. So apparently working on SNL and doing movies is quite profitable. But here's the interesting thing. Which credit card did he use for that transaction? Which airline miles program determined which credit card he was going to use? Do you understand the design problem from a product perspective? Neither of those things had any impact on his experience in terms of the commerce transaction. Rewards are not going to be a driver for which credit card he uses in that scenario. He's going to configure a payment vehicle or a value store and a payment rail to his AI assistant, and he's going to execute that by giving an instruction. The old design, which was the plastic card, the 16-digit number, the airline miles you get for usage, none of those parts of the artifact are useful in this future experience. Experience, not product. So as we sort of get into this and we start thinking about AI, this move to smart assistants and AI is just going to be a major thing, major sort of redesign in this experience layer. It's not just a new channel. I want you to forget about this. This is a way to engage in experiences. So we're going to start to give these agents, their smart assistants, we're going to give them a lot of power in terms of conducting commerce. Book me a restaurant for tomorrow night, a Chinese restaurant. Book me a flight to New York on next Thursday. In the evening in business class, put it on the corporate account. Once we give those instructions to our agent, the rest will sort of automatically happen with these AIs communicating. Now we're working on version 0.8 of this right now, chatbots that will do some of this stuff, but within 5 to 7 years we'll be delegating a lot of these decisions to our AI-based smart assistants. And products won't be in this world, experiences will. Now, AI's voice UI is the first step of this. By 2025, we'll be wearing mixed reality glasses, augmented reality glasses around, and we'll be embedding experiences in our field of view as well. For those of you that have 20/20 eyesight, I'm sorry to tell you, you're going to have to be wearing glasses in 7 or 8 years. They're going to be as common as iPhones were, back in 2007, back in 2025. If you guys want to know a little bit more about augmented reality and where this is going, a great book for you to check out is The Fourth Transformation by Robert Scoble and Shel Israel. They do a ton of research on this. This helmet is called the Daiquiri. It's an augmented reality safety helmet that you use. It's a hard hat with a built-in augmented reality view. So when you're working on things in a factory or in a engineering setting, it'll give you feedback and instructions and do that contextually. But we're going to be using this for a ton of different things, including education and entertainment and so forth. But experiences will surface here, not products. You won't be offered a credit card in a pop-up window on your augmented reality glasses. You will be given advice contextually on taking credit in a specific scenario. It won't be a productized experience, it'll just be an experience. Now, the other element of this is that for this experience-driven world to work, we have to start collecting a lot of data to make the decisions that will reference that. Geolocation is a key element of that data. Sensors that we wear on our person. For example, a heart rate monitor like this that costs about $50 for the Constitute hardware. We might wear this on our wrist and it'll be tracking our heart rate every minute of every day. Now, what this will be able to do within just about 18 months' time, we'll be able to actually predict you having a heart attack based on this longitudinal data analysis. This is something that a doctor in a clinic hooking you up to an EKG machine could never do. But this data is going to give us incredible abilities. And this is what's going to drive these experiences, the ability to anticipate and predict your needs when you walk into a grocery store and we know your salary hasn't come into your bank account yet, so we know you need a little bit of extra cash to do your grocery shopping. You don't need a credit card. You need credit in the grocery store. This is the shift to experience layer. Now, there's another key driver to this, is that as we start building these experiences, we have the same realization that Elon Musk had when he was building the Tesla factory. When he realized that he had to ramp up production of Teslas to meet demand, he realized the only way to do that would be automate the factory and get humans off the factory floor. In fact, he says, the reason we don't have humans on the factory floor is they slow down the production line to human speed. Now, you want to know the difference between Alibaba, Paytm, Movin, Number 26, and the incumbent banks is we don't operate at human speed anymore. We've gone beyond that, and that's part of the experience layer that we're redesigning. When you put humans in the process, there's one key weakness that you build into the bank, the inability to deliver revenue in real time. And that is not only going to be a differentiator, it's going to be absolutely essential to the survival of financial service organizations in the future. Now, when we come to the advice stakes, the key is that actually humans aren't going to differentiate. And the reason being is the AIs that will be built into this world for building these experiential layers are capturing tons of data. In the case of self-driving vehicles, about 1,000 times more than the human eye can capture. And they can process that information 70% faster than your neocortex can handle. So statistically speaking, there is no way you will be a better driver than an AI. There's no way that is possible. Now, we're only a few years away from that. So what happens in the future when cars are better drivers than humans? Would the City of London ban human drivers from the city centre? It's possible. This could happen because AIs are going to be better at this. Now, the reason AIs are going to be better is that they can process that information faster and synthesize that data. This is going to be, built into all these robots that we'll be using around the planet. By 2035, we're going to have more robots on the planet than humans. What's the most common form of robot you see in Hong Kong today? You can't answer this, Jay, because you know the answer I said the other day. Close. No, Teslas. Right? When Teslas are in semi-autonomous mode, they're a robot. So, you need to think a bit more laterally about what is a robot. They don't necessarily have to look like the Terminator or Eva out of Ex Machina. But by 2035, robots will be more common than humans. So AIs are learning very quickly based on machine learning. IBM Watson is already twice as accurate at diagnosing cancer than human doctors. That's why you always ask for a second opinion, because doctors generally get these sort of diagnoses right about 50% of the time. Watson gets it right 96% of the time. And AIs are starting to surprise us. This is the interlingua that was developed by Google's machine learning algorithm for translation. It's a language it came up with on its own to translate between different languages. The engineering team at Google didn't see this coming. It was a bit of a surprise for them. So AIs are going to surprise us, but they're also going to surprise us with a bit of personality. This is a self-driving race car from Audi. In fact, there's two of them. One's called AJ and one's called Bobby, Test Vehicle A and Test Vehicle B. Now this can compete with human race car drivers in terms of track speed. What's interesting is these two vehicles are identical in terms of hardware, firmware, software configuration, but they're based on machine learning algorithms. So AJ drives more aggressively around the track, does consistently better lap times than Bobby. When I asked the Audi team why is this, they said, yeah, we're not really sure. So AIs are already starting to develop personalities based on machine learning, even with the same hardware configuration. Identity verification, machines can do that better than humans already, about 20 times better than a human sitting in a branch looking at a document, which is astounding because you're still required to open an account in Hong Kong with a wet signature in a branch. Why? It's not because it's safer. Otherwise, the Hong Kong customs would require you to still do that process. So fintechs are going to be better at this because they deploy capital much more efficiently. And this is really where the differentiation is going to come in terms of market consideration. And the fact is that when you look at the incumbents, they have an innovation lag. This is the P2P Easy Pay from HSBC. When did PayPal launch? Does anyone know? 1994, right? P2P. What year is it now? So there's a bit of lag behind the innovation on P2P with some of the incumbents. But you know what? Here's the key problem. A lot of people, when you talk to them about fintech, say, oh, fintech is just a new skin on old rails. It's not. We're seeing the first principles approach is really completely redesigning the experience of banking based on surfacing utility on these new technologies. If you just try and put an old product on a new channel, it's not going to work. So ultimately, this means incumbents only have three choices. They can either partner with fintechs who deploy capital faster, they can acquire those fintechs, or they can try and mimic those fintechs. Now, ultimately, what's the best choice? Fintechs will always do it faster and cheaper than an incumbent can. So we say at Movem, we say about this, we bend space and time for our bank partners. We just did a deal with TD. I'm going to announce it exclusively to finish off this. We just did a deal with TD Bank just over Christmas, a 8-year deal to continue the commercial relationship with TD, and it's bringing us 20 million in funding just over the next 2 years. So this brings to total, it's not an equity deal, it's a commercial deal, but it brings our total for raise for Movem to about 44 million that we've put together since we founded in 2011. So it's a big deal for us, but the partnership model is working for them. Guys, thank you very much for your time today. The biggest bank of the next decade isn't going to be a bank at all. Thank you.